Imagine yourself wandering the cobblestone paths of imperial Rome during 67 AD, witnessing a scene that chills you to the bone. Emperor Nero himself walks confidently through the bustling forum alongside what seems to be his latest bride, an exquisite young woman adorned in luxurious fabrics and precious stones. Yet hushed conversations trail behind them because everyone understands the terrible reality. The woman accompanying the world's most influential ruler was formerly a youth called Sporus, and Nero's actions toward him constitute one of history's most deeply troubling examples of mental and physical torment. Before exploring these lost narratives of endurance and anguish, if you appreciate discovering history's concealed realities, please consider supporting this content with your engagement and sharing where you're tuning in from. It's remarkable how we can examine these ancient accounts together from various corners of the globe, united across centuries by our collective fascination with bygone eras. What follows transcends typical Roman indulgence stories, revealing how unlimited authority can twist affection into fixation, sorrow into insanity, and transform a person into a breathing puppet designed to fulfill one individual's warped desires. The identity of Sporus may be unknown to you, yet his tale will linger in your thoughts long afterward. Let's begin with the figure who orchestrated this catastrophe. Nero wasn't inherently malevolent. His initial leadership actually demonstrated considerable potential. Upon claiming the throne at merely 16, numerous Romans believed they were observing a magnificent era's beginning. He lowered taxation, sponsored public spectacles, and even participated in dramatic performances that entertained ordinary citizens. However, ultimate authority tends to corrupt even the most hopeful spirits, and by 65 AD something had irreparably shattered within the emperor's psyche. Perhaps it stemmed from perpetual suspicion that accompanies knowing everyone surrounding you covets your status. Perhaps it originated from the loneliness of being the sole individual in a 60 million-strong empire who could never face contradiction, challenge, or correction. Or perhaps it resulted from what befell the one person he professed to cherish above all existence. She was known as Poppaea Sabina, embodying everything Nero believed he desired in a companion, possessing breathtaking beauty, intelligence matching his own magnificent self-perception, and ambition sufficient to share his visions of everlasting fame. Yet Poppaea transcended being merely another attractive presence in the imperial circle. She wielded the kind of keen political intuition that rendered her either a powerful confederate or a threatening adversary. When Nero initially encountered Poppaea, he remained wed to Octavia, the former emperor's daughter. This had been an emotionally barren, strategically motivated union. Poppaea embodied everything Octavia lacked. Where Octavia remained subdued and modest, Poppaea sparkled with energy and authority. Where Octavia preferred avoiding notice, Poppaea delighted in commanding universal attention. The romance between Nero and Poppaea commenced as standard Roman controversy. Yet what began as infidelity rapidly transformed into something far more perilous: authentic fixation. Nero wasn't merely drawn to Poppaea's attractiveness, he became utterly consumed by her in ways that alarmed even his most trusted counselors. Historical accounts describe Nero's conduct during this era as increasingly unpredictable and controlling. He would erupt in homicidal fury if other men merely glanced at Poppaea too intently during ceremonial gatherings. He started positioning sentries around her constantly, supposedly for security, but actually to scrutinize her every exchange. He showered her with presents that depleted the royal coffers: precious stones from distant India, fine textiles from remote China, exotic fragrances from Arabian territories. Most significantly, he began restructuring reality itself to satisfy his obsession. Initially, he divorced Octavia, a scandalous decision that estranged numerous allies. Subsequently, he proclaimed his intention to wed Poppaea through elaborate imperial ceremonies. The celebration became an exhibition of extraordinary extravagance, with Nero investing unlimited resources to display his dedication. Even matrimony couldn't fulfill Nero's desire to completely possess Poppaea. He commenced isolating her from relatives and companions, encircling her with individuals whose existence depended entirely on his approval. He commissioned numerous paintings and sculptures depicting her, not merely for public exhibition, but for his personal chambers, enabling him to gaze upon her likeness even during separations. Ancient records indicate Nero would occasionally spend extended periods simply observing Poppaea conducting her routine activities. This transcended romantic commitment, representing behavior of someone who had mistaken love for possession, who perceived another human not as an autonomous individual, but as an attractive object existing exclusively for his gratification. Poppaea, meanwhile, appeared to comprehend the hazardous situation she navigated. She possessed sufficient intelligence to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession granted her extraordinary influence, yet remained astute enough to understand this power carried tremendous dangers. She began utilizing her sway to promote her family's welfare, establishing networks of allies who would shield her should Nero's affections diminish. However, Poppaea harbored one crucial weakness. She wasn't intimidated by confronting Nero. Unlike everyone else in the imperial establishment who had mastered anticipating the emperor's temperament, Poppaea maintained her independent spirit. She would dispute his policy choices, condemn his artistic endeavors, and even ridicule his performances when she deemed them inadequate. The specifics of what occurred on that tragic day in 65 AD differ according to which ancient chronicler you consult, yet the result remained consistent. During what commenced as an ordinary household disagreement, some accounts suggest concerning Nero returning late from racing events, others regarding his theatrical activities, the emperor lost restraint in ways that would torment him eternally. According to Tacitus, the conflict intensified when Poppaea dared criticize Nero's priorities, implying he valued his public reputation above his duties as spouse and father. She carried a child then, bearing what would have become their second offspring, and perhaps the stress rendered her less tolerant of Nero's increasingly unstable behavior. What transpired next has generated scholarly debate for centuries, though consensus suggests Nero, in explosive rage, either struck or kicked his expectant wife with such savage force that she sustained lethal internal damage. Some accounts describe a single blow to her midsection. Others portray sustained violence, leaving her hemorrhaging and unconscious on polished stone floors. Consider the instant when Nero recognized his actions. The individual commanding 30 legions, who could order executions with mere words, who received worship as divinity in eastern territories, had just annihilated the sole thing he genuinely valued. The woman he had obsessed over was perishing due to his own uncontrolled brutality. Ancient sources characterize the subsequent scene as among the most pitiful in imperial chronicles. Nero reportedly collapsed upon Poppaea's form, alternately pleading for her forgiveness and demanding she survive, as though his imperial power extended even over mortality itself. He summoned Rome's finest healers, offering them fortunes to preserve her existence, threatening them with agony should they fail. Yet it proved too late. Poppaea expired within hours, carrying with her the unborn child who might have succeeded Nero. In that moment, something essential fractured within the emperor's consciousness. The mourning that followed transcended mere emotional devastation. It represented complete disconnection from reality. Nero's grief became legendary. He refused having Poppaea's remains cremated, following Roman tradition, instead having them preserved and entombed more elaborately than previous emperors. He proclaimed her divine status founded a religious cult honoring her, and spent days conversing with her corpse as if she remained responsive. The imperial court now faced navigating an even more treacherous environment. Courtiers were required to participate in the pretense that Poppaea somehow continued living, addressing her in present tense and maintaining her preferred seating vacant during feasts. Anyone suggesting the emperor should progress forward faced immediate banishment or worse. During this period, Sporus first attracted Nero's attention, though the young individual had no awareness he was entering a nightmare. Sporus was likely around 14 or 15, born into household slavery and liberated as a child. He had been raised within palace boundaries, receiving education preparing him for administrative responsibilities. This actually represented relatively privileged circumstances. Freedmen in imperial service frequently enjoyed superior conditions than freeborn citizens of lower status. However, this privilege accompanied complete dependence on imperial goodwill. Freedmen owed everything to their former owner's generosity, creating absolute vulnerability. They could achieve great influence, but also face disposal, punishment or execution arbitrarily without legal protection. What distinguished Sporus in Nero's perception wasn't his intellect or abilities, it was his appearance. Multiple ancient sources confirm the young man possessed an extraordinary resemblance to deceased Poppaea, particularly regarding the eyes and delicate facial structure. In a society where Romans believed physical similarity indicated deeper spiritual connections, this likeness would have seemed almost mystical. The initial time Nero saw Sporus following Poppaea's death, something triggered in the emperor's damaged mind. Here existed an opportunity to reverse the irreversible, to restore what he had destroyed. The resemblance proved so remarkable that momentarily Nero may have genuinely believed he was witnessing Poppaea's spirit returning in different form. Naturally, one obvious obstacle existed. Sporus was male, yet for someone who had convinced himself of his divinity, who had spent months addressing a corpse, altering someone's gender seemed like a minor impediment. What followed represents one of history's most deliberate acts of cruelty. Nero didn't simply decide forcing Sporus to dress femininely, he decided making the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned Rome's finest physicians and commanded them to perform surgery on the young man, purely to enhance his feminine appearance. This transcended mere mutilation, it was systematic destruction of Sporus's human identity. The procedure was hazardous, agonizing and irreversible, frequently resulting in death from infection or blood loss. Even if Sporus survived, he would remain forever altered physically, emotionally, and socially. He would never sire children, never experience normal relationships, never even be considered fully masculine by Roman society. The surgery occurred within the imperial palace in chambers specifically prepared for this purpose. Ancient surgical methods were rudimentary, depending on basic tools and primitive pain relief. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours, with substantial risk of mortality. Sporus would have been restrained by guards while physicians approached with their instruments, knowing his cries would meet indifferent ears. Once Sporus recovered, a process requiring weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even jaded Roman nobility. He intended marrying the young man through full imperial wedding ceremonies. The preparations consumed months and enormous resources. Sporus received a new identity, Sabina, after the dead empress, and was relocated to special accommodations where he could be prepared for his new existence. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe, designing garments that would flatter his altered physique and conceal remaining masculine features. Master craftsmen forged ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating jewels that had previously belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't merely accessories, they were concrete links to the deceased woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being compelled to replace. Cosmetic experts instructed him in techniques to feminize his features. They demonstrated how to use eye makeup to enlarge his eyes, how to apply coloring for rosy complexions, how to use powders to soften angular features. These lessons transcended mere appearance. They were exercises in systematic obliteration of his original identity. Hairstylists trained him in elaborate techniques, fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was trimmed, curled, and arranged in intricate patterns, frequently incorporating expensive decorations. The process could require hours daily, necessitating multiple servants and heated metal implements. Yet perhaps most psychologically destructive were lessons in feminine behavior and conduct. Sporus was assigned instructors who taught him walking, sitting, and gesturing in appropriately ladylike manners. He learned proper hand positioning, foot placement, clothing arrangement while seated, and moving through space conveying elegance rather than masculine strength. Speech coaches worked with him to modify his vocal patterns, teaching higher tones and adopting linguistic characteristics associated with feminine communication. This proved perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply embedded and difficult to consciously alter. Can you envision the psychological torment of this transformation? Daily Sporus was compelled to observe mirrors, reflecting a stranger wearing his features. Every lesson in feminine deportment reminded him that his identity was being systematically eliminated. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a deceased woman now became a restraint binding him to a role he never selected. The wedding was planned for spring 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious celebrations that would add ceremonial significance. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of Rome's greatest emperor. The ceremony occurred in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported blossoms and illuminated by thousands of oil flames. Musicians performed traditional wedding melodies, while servants offered finest wines and delicacies to external observers who didn't understand the complete story. It might have appeared like a normal imperial wedding, yet those aware understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and disturbing. Here stood the world's most powerful individual, publicly marrying a surgically altered teenage boy dressed as his deceased wife. The ceremony included all customary Roman rituals, exchanging promises, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, signing legal documents making this union official. The attendees performed their parts with accomplished theatrical skills, offering congratulations and valuable gifts while maintaining appropriate celebration. Yet the atmosphere must have been dense, with barely hidden horror, fascination, and nervous tension that accompanies participating in something fundamentally wrong. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, quarters within the palace complex, and income from the imperial treasury. He had his own transportation for traveling, horses for riding, and retinue of supporters. Yet all this apparent luxury carried a terrible cost. Complete erasure of his original identity and constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and portray the devoted wife in all interactions. This transcended mere appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully revived Poppaea. He would address Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never occurred, and expect responses maintaining the elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest error could mean death. He had to remember not just how to appear and behave like a woman, but how to respond as if he were Poppaea herself. When Nero mentioned events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he recalled them personally. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly proficient at this deception, developing an almost supernatural capacity to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. Yet they also note he grew more withdrawn and despondent as time progressed, though he continued performing his assigned role flawlessly in public. The psychological pressure is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning, Sporus awakened in chambers decorated to remind him of a deceased woman he'd never known. Every mirror reflection bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required pretending to be someone else, possessing memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years, Sporus endured this bizarre existence, yet his ordeal reached new extremes when Nero decided to tour Greece. The emperor considered himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals where he believed his talents would be properly recognized. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries as Rome's empress. Imagine Greek aristocrats trying to comprehend their conqueror, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding everyone treat this obvious fiction as reality. Yet by 68 AD, Nero's excesses had finally pushed the Roman establishment beyond tolerance. Rebellions erupted across the empire, led by governors exhausted with the emperor's erratic behavior and governmental neglect. The Praetorian Guard declared opposition to Nero's continued rule, and the Senate condemned him as a state enemy. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, the emperor couldn't abandon his living reminder of Poppaea. They sheltered in a villa outside Rome, waiting for either rescue or capture, while Nero alternated between grandiose escape schemes and theatrical preparations for suicide. When word arrived that enemies were approaching, Nero finally chose death over capture, yet his suicide left Sporus incredibly vulnerable. As one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign, he was both a valuable prize and dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. What followed proved perhaps even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn, transferred from one powerful man to another like valuable property first claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, then by Otho, then by Vitellius, each treating him much as Nero had, maintaining him dressed as a woman and calling him by Poppaea's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its ultimate conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in a reenactment of mythological scenes involving violence and humiliation. For Sporus, this represented the ultimate degradation, being sexually humiliated before thousands for their amusement. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He ended his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque performance that had consumed his existence. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. Yet ancient historians seemed less interested in Sporus as a person than as a symbol of imperial decadence. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self survived. His suicide was both tragedy and final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did he want to do with his life? All of that was erased when he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that his original identity disappeared entirely. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, who finally chose death over further degradation. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. In choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him throughout his adult life, the power to make his own choice about his fate. His story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion, even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years.